Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's event at the LSE South Asia Center, the next in our Fact and Fiction series, where we choose one particular book, usually a monograph, and have a discussion surrounding it. I'm very happy to announce that this afternoon's book is by our visiting fellow. It's Antonio Giustozzi's latest monograph titled Jihadism in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and the Local Militants, which was published last year in 2023. I'm not going to say too much about the book myself because Antonio is here and I'm just going to invite him to make a presentation about the book. And we are very, very happy that we're able to do this afternoon's event with an eminent panel of experts, and also because I'm sure this is the second, if not the third book by Antonio on which we're doing an event. So that's really very, very good for us to listen from him and learn as well. But before that, I'd like to say a very big welcome to all of you who've joined us from various parts of the world. Thank you very much for the interest you've shown in the event, for your emails, for your queries. And I hope that you enjoyed this afternoon's discussion. As you will see, and this is some information for all of you who are watching this on YouTube, the event is actually happening on Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. And the chat function is enabled. So please feel free to ask a question via the chat function there. And I will pose the question at irregular intervals. You are welcome. You're very welcome to pose a question to a particular speaker. It doesn't necessarily have to be to the author. It can be to any speaker once you have heard all of them speak. You can also pose a question, a general question, to the entire panel, and I will then pose it accordingly to the panel later on once they make their initial remarks. If you would like to tweet, then please do tweet and tag us at SAsiaLSC. And also one more thing and this concerns questions, which is that had this event been happening on site at LSE, members of the audience at LSE are entitled to ask questions in live events without revealing their identity. And to stay as close to the spirit of that, when I ask questions, I will not be announcing your name. I'll simply be asking the question that you have asked. So just to stay close to the spirit of it. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce the author of the book under discussion today, and also the panelists, the speakers, the experts. The order in which I introduce them is the order in which they will speak. We've had a brief discussion just before we came live with the event, and the order in which I introduce them is the order in which they will speak. They will speak one after the other, and once they have all spoken, then we will have a discussion amongst the experts about the book. The author and the first speaker in our event this afternoon is Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who is visiting fellow here at the LSE South Asia Center and is affiliated with the Royal United Services Institute, that is better known as RUSI, in London. Antonio is the author of the book being discussed today, Jihadism in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and Local Militants. Our first panelist is Abubakar Siddque, who is a journalist at RFE RL. For those of you who don't know, that's Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. They're Radio Azadi. And Abubakar specializes in the coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and is the author of the Pashtun Question, the Unresolved Key to the Future of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was published in 2014, but was also recently included in The Economist's list of 6 books to read and understand, quote, a large and strategically important country, unquote, that is Pakistan. Dr. Farzana Shaikh is Associate Fellow of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House here in London and an expert on South Asian security issues, especially Pakistan. Abdul Basit is Senior Associate Fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, that is ICPVTR, at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the National University of Singapore, and is co-author of Dynamics of Taliban Insurgency in FATA, which was published in 2013. FATA, for those of you who don't know, is Federally Administered Tribal Areas, Pakistan. Everyone, welcome to this afternoon's event. Antonio, I'm going to invite you to speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. This is a book for those who are maybe interested in it. And essentially, as the title and subtitle already made clear, the book is really very much about two things. One is the relationship between local and global jihad in Pakistan, and the other one is the relation between jihadist movements and the Pakistani state. Now, in principle, this per se is not something new. There has been a lot of discussion about the role of the Pakistani state, for example, in supporting jihad in Kashmir, for example, but also jihad in Afghanistan. But what's new in the book, essentially, I argue that that is largely true, but also there's more to it in the sense that there's been some mingling of the Pakistani state also with global jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State on and off, So, and of course, it's a complex relationship, and I think one of the most difficult things on the book when you read it is trying to keep track of that because at ups and downs, and it's always quite nuanced. I don't think you can make a very strong statement about the relationship. The nuance is really the essence of the relationship. And of course, I have to say the book essentially is probably, as any book, a bit behind the curve in terms of developments. Is around, say, maybe 18 months behind, if not more. Things that kept happening, of course. But I think most of what happened since highlight one thing clearly: uh, the the big questions of whether the Pakistani state and stressed state, as opposed to just the armed forces of Pakistan, in the end, gain from this relationship or not. Of course, most people will say no, and of course, outside Pakistan in particular, many people will say no. But I don't think the answer is that simple, that straightforward. I think we see today, for example, a lot of states which are not dominant in the region or worldwide, adopting, if you like, asymmetric tactics to increase the weight in international politics. Recently here at RUSI, for example, we're doing a project on Wagner Group in Africa, where Russia normally would not have much of a presence these days, except if they used this kind of tools. So it might be controversial, but actually it's increasingly popular as a way of carrying out operations abroad or having influence. And there could be a lot to say about other states in the Middle East, for example, at various stages supporting jihadist groups for foreign policy purposes and whatever. So I think the answer is not that simple. Of course, we don't know what would happen if Pakistan had not supported or helped various jihadist groups. Would the jihadist threat to Pakistan today not be there? Probably they would still be there because it's a widespread issue across the Muslim world. Probably would be different in nature, will look somewhat different. Certainly, if we look at the recent development, what do we have? We have, I'm not going to discuss this in detail, the very problematic relationship of the Pakistani state in general with the new regime in Afghanistan, the Taliban, which surprised many, but probably those who were investigating this and knew how unpopular Pakistan was with many members of the Taliban will not be so surprised. But also what we had is the continued recovery of the TTP that has been gaining strength and unifying. This process started actually before the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, but many people believe that was strengthened by the Taliban takeover in terms at least of the encouragement and the morale boost that TTP got from Taliban victory in Afghanistan. But also we have some other developments which are not as well or as widely discussed in the media. And certainly because we here at RUSI have been doing a lot of work on the Islamic State in Khorasan in general recently, we can certainly see that from the point of view of the Islamic State, Pakistan looks almost like a hope now. They're really struggling in Afghanistan. They have serious financial issues even in the Middle East, so they don't get much support from the leaders anymore. But they see Pakistan as a polity that is struggling, and they see opportunity there, different types of opportunity. In particular, of course, they do have a presence and they do operate in parts of Pakistan, especially Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but they also have ambitions to expand operations beyond that. They are now trying to convince the leaders in the Middle East to authorize them to essentially take over the rest of Pakistan as an army operation again, as they were doing in the regions before Pakistan province of the Islamic State was established some years ago. But also they see that within the wide jihadist community in Pakistan, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, disaffection in particular towards the Pakistani state. What in the book are called the Kashmiri groups, which in reality are not from Kashmir, but I call them like that because they were focused on Kashmir, on supporting the insurgency in Kashmir against the Indian state and also carrying out operation in India. The Kashmiri, so-called Kashmiri groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed are now, of course, not allowed to operate on a large scale in Kashmir or in India. They don't receive a lot of funding anymore, almost none. And they're very disappointed, if you like, and especially at the grassroots level, there is resentment. This was not expected, the fact that would be one day let down by the Pakistani state and the Pakistani forces. So from the point of view of the Islamic State, they look at this as a potential constituency, and especially Lashkar-e-Taiba, because they are essentially Salafis, they are Ali Hadith, and they see that as a natural constituency that they could tap, and they're trying. You can see on the jihadist charts that there is this kind of discussion among jihadists of different groups, and they see increasingly Khorasan, the Khorasan province of the Islamic State, as the best option to keep the flag of jihad alive. In terms, the actual terms, few of them actually join. We know there's at least some tens of members of Lashkar-e-Taiba join in recent months. It's not a huge flow, but in a way, I think quite worrying, I would say, from the perspective of the Pakistani state, that even this kind of discussion might be going on. So I think this really reinforces, this kind of need to debate whether, from the point of view of Pakistan, these policies of using and manipulating jihadist groups for their own foreign policy objectives, in the end, was wise or not. And recently we also had these clashes on the border with Iran, and of course the Iranians have long alleged that the Baluchi rebels in Iran receive support via Pakistan, if not from Pakistan. That's more controversial in my view in terms of the extent of support, but again, it's the same kind of issues. The relationship, even tolerance, if you like, is a form of foreign policy intervention that sometimes can have, of course, as now a blowback. So I think, of course, inevitably, these kind of questions are always controversial, and people will have different views. I want to stress, I'm not a Pakistan basher, so I didn't write the book to basically as a kind of propaganda exercise. I do think that from the point of view of a country like Pakistan, the options in terms of foreign policy making are limited, because of course the environment where they operate, with India next to it, they offer limited opportunities. So of course, if you assume that you want to have a strong and aggressive foreign policy, which I think Pakistan wants to have, then your options are limited. And I think, we have to think of the policy debate as it takes place even more than in Islamabad in Rawalpindi. I think from the point of view of the Pakistani armed forces, the real issues, can we do without, somewhat aggressive foreign policy? For aggressive, I mean not necessarily worse than that of Russia or the United States or a number of other countries, a proactive, let's call it proactive foreign policy. I think, is a genuine policy question. If I was sitting in Rawalpindi, facing the prospect of a curtailed military budget, these kind of issues would be there on the table. And I think these are the kind of discussion that in the past probably took place there. So I think I spoke enough for now, and I'll just pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. That was very good and a very good introduction to your book. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these questions later on. But I'm now going to invite our first panelist, Abubakar Siddque, who is a journalist at Radio Azadi, which is part of Radio Free Europe. Abubakar specializes in the coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan and is author of The Pashtun Question, The Unresolved Key to the Future of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was published in 2014 and was recently included in The Economist's list of 6 books to read to understand a large and strategically important country that is Pakistan. I did this introduction earlier, but I did it again as well just now, just for the benefit of those online who may have joined later on. Abubakar, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Sarkar, and I'm greatly honored to be part of such a distinguished panel. I think talking about Pakistan and jihadism, the first question we need to ask is whether Pakistan is a victor or a victim of global jihad. We should remember that on Pakistani strategic calculus, after the independence of Bangladesh in 1971, the Pakistani state the key lesson they took away from this was that they were not strong enough in imposing or creating the Islamic identity of Pakistan. Pakistan was originally created as a homeland for the South Asian Muslims. And that from that point onward, guided some of the strategic policy making in Pakistan. And it began with Afghanistan, of course, where Dawood, secular nationalism, championing of secular Pashtun nationalism in Afghanistan of Afghan President Dawood in 1970s. He became a president after ending the 250-year-old monarchy in 1973. And he supported the Pashtun and the Baloch, whose governments were dismissed by then populist Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So Antonio's book I think, is a very good research monograph on that basically encompasses the period of the global war on terror. And this is the period where some of the strategic thinking behind why Pakistan adopted this Islamist policy of becoming, in some Pakistani strategic minds, the true Muslim state, responsible for looking after the Ummah and interest. And of course, then the Afghan Jihad made it possible for Pakistan to fund some of these dreams or realize some of the dreams in terms of supporting and the global jihad. We all know that Al-Qaeda was created and born in Afghanistan, Pakistan. And this is where Al-Qaeda reached its zenith, the height of its power, when it launched the 2001 attacks. So Antonio has basically done a very good job of using the interview technique to talk to a lot of various jihadist figures, fighters and others, to present us a very rich, detailed analysis of Islamic Jihad and its relations with Pakistan and how Pakistani state dealt with it, what were the how it benefited from it, or it thought it benefited from it, and how it paid a very huge price. I think I will highly recommend it. I think this book there are a few things that would have enriched the book. One of the things that I felt was lacking was more discussion of the jihadist literature. I mean, I have, in my own research, have found it very informative that if you read, I mean, of course, as Antonio mentioned in his book, you can't rely on their word, per se, because a lot of it is propaganda, but that's one key thing that would have added to it. And then I think it would have been more. It is already a very good book for academics, researchers, analysts, both in and out of the government. But it should have been more accessible to the general public, which should, I think, always be the aim of this kind of writing. Now, the main point I want to make is what are the lessons of this study for the present crisis? To understand Pakistan, we have to think in terms of Pakistani state as basically two states. There is the de jure state, that is, Pakistan is a parliamentary democracy. It's supposed to run under a constitution, but the de jure state is always dominated or overshadowed by the de facto state, which is run by the military journals and the policies they make. So in terms of jihad, I think the Pakistanis made up their policies as they went. They never had like a strategic foresight or a long-term strategic calculus to bring in and mitigate against at least its domestic fallout. I know that Pakistan everybody knows today that Pakistan's foreign policy has not been very successful. So, for example, after the 2014 school attack in the northwestern city of Peshawar, the school massacre, there was Pakistani civilian and military leadership agreed on this national action plan. And where is the plan now? Nearly a decade later, it has not been implemented. If parts of it were very poorly implemented. And one of the key strategic debacle for Pakistan is the turning the Afghan Taliban, as Antonio alluded to in his presentation, the turning of Afghan Taliban against Pakistan. I have been following, of course, I report on these issues as part of my day job. But I've been following particularly what the Taliban are saying after these attacks on just this week on March 18, and then the Taliban retaliated. The Taliban are basically now telling their supporters or the public that they should be ready for a jihad against Pakistan. And they're telling their supporters that this is just jihad. This is a remarkable failure of nothing, I think, captures the Pakistan's failure of Pakistani jihadi policy or Pakistan policy of using irregular jihadist warfare groups for its foreign policy objectives. And then, of course, all of these things are very short term. We have had a very different policy, for example, towards the Taliban when the Taliban first returned to power in August 2021. Contrary to what anybody might believe, Pakistan, in fact, had very little part in the actual return of the Taliban. Of course, Pakistani hosting of the Taliban insurgency played a very large role. And this is again goes to the question of de facto state and de jure state. In Pakistan, the de facto state, unfortunately, is not accountable. For example, let's consider just how Pakistan actually deals with security crisis that arises from jihadist attacks. I have looked very hard, and I'll be surprised if anybody has studied in detail and found different and has come across different findings of the fact that 80,000 Pakistanis were killed in these jihadist violence under different various names, but none of their deaths were ever investigated. Nobody was ever held accountable. Nobody's ever held accountable for security failures in Pakistan, apart from, for example, there was the famous Abbottabad commission after Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan by the US Special Forces in May 2011. But even then, no person was held responsible. No, there was no accountability. And this is the case for all of these attacks. And unfortunately for Pakistan, jihadism has fired back so much, its support for jihadism. The blowback is so severe that now even secular ethno-nationalist groups, such as the Balochistan Liberation Army, which just today on March 20 attacked the southern seaport city of Gawadar. It launched a major attack. It is also adopting the jihadist tactics of suicide bombing, of conducting mass, these kind of what they call the Fidai attacks, the suicide attacks. And I think for Pakistanis, again, Pakistan is always at this crossroad. But I think for Pakistanis, the key thing will be to think about how the de facto state can now surrender its policy making powers to the de jure state, which still has a fighting chance of overcoming the crisis created by Pakistan's past support of jihadist violence or jihadi groups.
Thank you very much, Abubakar. That was great. I'm going to invite Farzana now, but just before that, you mentioned something just now, and I just wanted a clarification for the benefit of also those who are listening online, which is you said that the Taliban has said to its followers that it should sort of launch a jihad against Pakistan. Taliban to its followers in Afghanistan?
Yeah, the Taliban to its followers. I mean, the Taliban are not following. Let me clarify. The Taliban are not. They've not announced a formal jihad, but they're making the mindset. They're making the public opinion. They're shaping the public opinion in a way. If you listen to Taliban talk shows on Afghan television station, including the state television station, and whatever remains of the free media in the country, they're saying that jihad is upon us against Pakistan. Because Pakistan has done so many disasters. It's responsible for so many disasters in Afghanistan's recent history that if it comes to it, we have no other way. And Taliban wasted no time. Hours after Pakistan attacked, the Taliban military was ordered to shoot lob artillery shells and shoot rockets into Pakistan. And they did target military targets.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that was an important clarification, and I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of this. But I'm now going to invite our next speaker, Dr. Farzana Shaikh, who is Associate Fellow of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House here in London, and an expert on South Asian security issues, especially Pakistan. Farzana, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilanjan. I'd like to thank you formally, of course, as the organizer of this event, and the South Asia Center at LSC for inviting me to to discuss this new book by Antonio Giustozzi. It is a pleasure, but one that I must say is somewhat tinged with concern. For the questions that Antonio raises offer no easy answers, and their implications are extremely disturbing for millions of people who live in the troubled regions that connect Pakistan and Afghanistan, the site of these investigations. But reading this fine-grained study of jihadism in Pakistan, I could not help but be reminded of Olivier Roy's classic work on the failure of political Islam, published almost 3 decades ago. Let me explain why. In this book, Antonio makes what I think is a convincing case to show that the vulnerabilities of jihadism in Pakistan and arguably elsewhere are best understood in terms of its internal differences, its contradictions in strategy, and its failure to resolve the tension between global and local jihadists. And these, rather than the coordinated efforts of a US-led military response to contain jihadism, since 2001, Antonio argues, explain its uneven course in Pakistan. But I think what also runs through Antonio's study, at least for me, prompting echoes of Olivier Roy, is a sense that the weakness of jihadism lies also in the abject failure of jihadists to translate their ideology into a concrete and viable blueprint for society. Much like Roy's present-day neo-fundamentalists, who have no time for the intellectual responses to modernity that were common to an earlier generation of Islamists, Antonio's present-day jihadists also appear as little more than groups of restless and alienated men who worry about morals and the corrupting influence of the West, but are singularly devoid of any real political or economic vision. That said, I find it rather curious that Antonio's analysis of jihadi groups in Pakistan is exclusively focused on men and overlooks the role of women as architects of jihadism. For there is now, I think, enough evidence to show that women have played a decisive role in sharpening the language of jihad in Pakistan. Since mounting a dramatic rearguard action in 2007 from the premises of the Jamia Hafsa, the seminary for women attached to the famous Red Mosque in Islamabad, female jihadists have emerged as key players in amplifying the call for holy war against the Pakistani state. But obviously, constraints of time keep me from elaborating any further on this point, because what I want to do now is really to make a couple of additional observations that I believe would widen the scope of Antonio's work. The first is to underscore the importance of historical contextualization. Antonio does a great job of delineating the landscape of jihadism in Pakistan since 2001 and offers some truly arresting insights into the covert arrangements that helped consolidate ties between jihadi groups, notably Al-Qaeda, and the so-called deep state in Pakistan between 2005 and 2011. But for the historians among us who have studied Pakistan from its inception, these developments, while plainly shocking to an observer today, are broadly in line with a long-established pattern of state complicity in the promotion of jihadism in Pakistan. To be fair, Antonio recognizes this by paying attention to the historical impact of the Afghan civil war in the 1980s, which sealed Pakistan's current status as what he calls, quote, host to the largest concentration of jihadist groups in the world. But I would argue that notwithstanding its significance as a watershed moment in advancing the cause of jihadism in Pakistan, the Afghan civil war and its management by Pakistan's military-led Islamist regime at the time should not be read as an exceptional development. Pakistan's tryst with jihadism, which I have argued elsewhere in my book, is symptomatic of the state's ambiguous relationship with Islam more generally, has a long pedigree that predates the Afghan civil war and that coincides with the creation of the state. And indeed, it has been well documented. For there now exists a body of work to show how Pakistan deliberately used the language of jihad to mobilize Pashtun tribesmen immediately after independence in 1947-48 to encourage them to mount raids into Kashmir and wrest control of the region from India. These efforts were sanctioned at the time by religious scholars drafted in by the government to issue rulings or fatwas, declaring the raids as acts of jihad to liberate Kashmir from non-Muslim forces under the command of India. Some military officers also set a precedent at the time, later to become familiar, by projecting themselves as mujahideen fighting a holy war. The use of jihadist groups as instruments of state policy by Pakistan was by no means confined to the execution of the country's regional conflict with India, although this was and continues to be unarguably key driver, as Antonio is well aware. Yet, what can sometimes be overlooked in how regional dynamics of jihadism in Pakistan have been informed by and draw on national imperatives resting on Pakistan's use of jihadist groups in defense of the country's putative Islamic identity. Again, I think these found expression almost a decade before the Afghan civil war helped burnish Pakistan's credentials as the quintessential Islamic State charged with the righteous mission of overseeing a holy war. In 1971, in the course of its own brutal civil war in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, the Pakistani state harnessed armed Islamist groups to serve as mujahideen and to wage jihad against, quote, the enemies of Islam posing as Bengali nationalists. While it took time for Pakistan's army eventually to commit to an Islamist agenda, once forged, that commitment was decisive in setting the stage for future cooperation between the state and jihadi groups, culminating in the Grand Alliance which came to define the Afghan civil war of the 1980s. But I think it would be wrong to suggest that the promotion of jihadism in Pakistan has been the sole preserve of the military establishment. For while few would argue with the proposition that Pakistan remains firmly in the grip of a military establishment deeply compromised by its ties to jihadist groups, the country's mainstream political parties have also done much to normalize the language of jihad through the conduct of their politics. And this brings me to my second point, which is that any study of jihadism in Pakistan needs to factor in the growing corpus of work that points conclusively to mainstream political parties and their role in normalizing the language of jihad through their working relationship with violent jihadi groups. Again, there is a long history of such alliances that date back to the 1990s, when mainstream parties, including the apparently secular Pakistan People's Party, forged ties with Islamic parties known to have close organizational and political ties to militant jihadi groups. More recent work has highlighted the close relationship between the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and Sunni jihadi groups, notably the SSP in Punjab. The PTI, led by the former Prime Minister Imran Khan, also did much to normalize the language of jihad by appropriating the language of jihadist outfits such as Harkatul Mujahideen, whose leaders it welcomed into its ranks. As Prime Minister, of course, Imran Khan famously declared his support for the Afghan Taliban and himself worked actively to rehabilitate the TTP. So in conclusion, let me say that for me, the main takeaway from Antonio's book is not only to be reminded of the intellectual bankruptcy of jihadism, but to have its shaky foundations exposed, resting as they do on ever-shifting, unstable alliances. This should not, of course, be any cause for complacency, for instability, as we know, can exact a terrible cost on human lives in Pakistan and beyond. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Farzana. I'm sure we will come back to a lot of what you've said. Thank you, and that was very, very useful, both for us as well as for those who are listening online. I'm going to, without ado, invite our final panelist, Abdul Basit, who is Senior Associate Fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the National University of Singapore. And Abdul is co-author of Dynamics of Taliban Insurgency in FATA, which was published in 2013. Abdul, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to LSE's South Asia Center for having me. A couple of words about the book. I think it addresses two very key themes. A is the relationship of the Pakistani state with various jihadist groups at different eras in time. And that's the elephant in the room. The other one, and I really want to pick up on that later on, is the nexuses of various jihadist groups. How these groups over the years, if we see this militant landscape as a competitive arena where these groups have coexisted, resulting in, various patterns of their rivalries and cooperations, engendering splintering, alliances, mergers, re-splintering, remergers. It paints a very, very complex picture. And where I really want to, praise Antonio's work is that he really gives the agency to these groups as well. They are not merely just proxies, but some of them, spiraled out of the Pakistani state's control, invent their own ways, and had rivalries with the state as well. State, of course, continues to have its love-hate relationship with these groups. The latest example and addition to that is the Afghan Taliban. For 2 decades, Pakistani state supported them, and now see where they stand. So this is an old story which is continuously repeating itself. So it sounds like a broken record, right? But what is going on now is really, and I want to zoom in here, is what it means for the future. I think we are witnessing a new phase of militancy here. And I think the entire landscape has transformed in a sense that what you now have is a conducive environment. What we need to grapple with is that a jihadist group now has a state. And this is where I slightly differ with Dr. Farzana, that yes, the intellectual bankruptcy is there, but there is one success at least, that they have a state and they're governing it their way. Yes, they don't have any blueprint of economy, politics, vision for the state, but they have a jihadi state. Islamic State created one between Iraq and Syria, but they lost their territory. But the Deobandi militants have a state. And there are local and regional groups now, and some transnational groups, of course, which under their umbrella are now, seeing this as a watershed movement, at least in the jihadist view. And I think that's a dangerous development. And Pakistan is now paying the price of its own strategic myopia there. So I think 4 trend lines are pretty clear to me. Number one is that decentralized structures of these militant organizations are now moving towards centralization. And this is a lesson that they have learned from the Taliban. So TTP as a loose network or a conglomerate of various militant groups, or we can call it as a network of networks, are now centralizing. So we see this tendency of various groups, about 49 jihadist groups, pledging allegiance to TTP. And it is, once again, has a very hierarchical structure. And that's a lesson that they have learned from the Taliban. Taliban, despite, giving operational autonomy to various factions still was a very hierarchical organization which maintained a battlefield discipline, and that's the secret to their open secret of their success as well. TTP more or less is doing the same, and TTP is also then announcing these shadow provinces, vilayats, and dividing Pakistan into military zones and trying to imitate the Taliban's model of insurgency. If you look at TTP in its current incarnation, it is somewhere between an insurgency and a terrorist group. It is a terrorist group which behaves like an insurgent group. It doesn't have the territorial control or the public support in Pakistan, which are two essential elements to be an insurgency. So we can call it as a proto-insurgent or a hybrid terrorist group. So it is trying to transform, but it has serious impediments. What it does have is a sanctuary under the Taliban's umbrella, which is allowing it to continuously evolve in a new direction. The second major trend line that we see, with the exception of the Islamic State of Khorasan, which goes against the stream and challenges Taliban's monopoly, while the rest of the group pretty much accept Taliban as the hegemon of this jihadist landscape. ISK goes in the opposite direction. Rivalries are being replaced with cooperation, intra-organizational and inter-organizational cooperation. So I gave you the example of about 49 jihadist groups, various sizes, pledging allegiance to TTP's current Amir, Noor Wali Masood. At the same time, we are also seeing ongoing talks between one of the groups, Hafiz Gul Bahadur Group, Lashkar-e-Islam, and TTP of a possible merger. So rivalries, splintering have been replaced primarily with cooperation. Cooperation at the strategic level, cooperation at the operational level, which has increased the operational capacity of these groups. The third trend line that I see clearly is that globalization has given way to localization of militant narratives. TTP, ironically, has in one of its statements distanced itself from Al-Qaeda. And they clearly say that we are very locally focused. And even to so many events such as cricket events in Pakistan, and to the propaganda of TTP attacking China, they have clearly come out and saying that they are a Pakistan-focused group, pose no threat to the international community or any supporting events taking place in Pakistan. And the distancing of TTP from Al-Qaeda, while it's an open secret that Al-Qaeda created TTP. Al-Qaeda, as Antonio mentions in his book, a lot of time mediated and bridging differences between various sections of TTP. TTP trying to disown Al-Qaeda is also a lesson they have learned from the Taliban, in a sense that if you keep your goals local and distance yourself from global jihadists, perhaps if you persevere with strategic patience, perhaps you can achieve your goals. And that the model of Taliban success and that template in Afghanistan is in front of them. The fourth trend is that violence is being met with very robust political propaganda. Dr. Farzana talked about intellectual bankruptcy of these groups. That is very correct. Taliban perhaps are the more intellectually the weakest militant groups out there. Or if you look at it as an Islamist organization, you look at Brotherhood and other organizations, they still have that tradition. They have their ideologues. But there is no document. Only recently the Taliban's so-called Chief Justice has come out with a book in Arabic. But apart from that, there is no document that you can read and say, okay, this is what Taliban want and this is what their worldview is. So it's a very degenerative form of Deobandi militarism. But nonetheless, what they're doing, they have become very smart in social media propaganda. They bring out magazines, infographics, they engage in political debates, they comment on political events in the country, they articulate their positions, and they have become very smart with the use of social media, not only for propaganda, for recruiting, but also for fundraising. So the role of social media has been very, very important in shaping trends of militancy here. My very last point is the generational change within the region vis-a-vis the militants. Dr. Farzana very importantly mentioned about the evolving role of females. Abubakar talked about BLA imitating these jihadist tactics of suicide terrorism. Suicide terrorism has not only gone to ethno-separatist groups, but there are female suicide bombers within Baloch separatists as well. And there are females, though the role of females in Pakistan and Afghanistan has evolved from secondary role as matchmakers, propagandists, recruiter, fundraisers to do more primary roles in combats as suicide bombers, etc. And that's very, very important. And this is Gen Z of the jihadists that we are dealing with. So they just don't come from tribal backgrounds, but they also come from very educated, affluent backgrounds. The recent example of ISK cell that was busted in Islamabad, if you look at the age group, and if you look at the background, all these were young kids who were recruited and radicalized by ISKP on internet, on social media, from Instagram, Telegram, different other channels. And some of these, and it included girls and boys from very elite universities of Islamabad. And if you look at that group, some of them were even Shia, and they were supporting ISKP, which is a Salafist organization. So, and that doesn't add up, but just the thrill of it and the kind of slick propaganda they offer and the way they try to manipulate the identity crisis of youth in Pakistan, they offered them some easy answers and lured them in. So Gen Z of militants in Pakistan is not just facing an identity crisis, but a state which is failing them are being lured by these terrorist groups on social media. And I think by sitting in Afghanistan and having easy access and safe access to the internet, the kind of propaganda that these groups are dishing out, I think is dangerous. And last thing about just a point on ISKP, and I'll stop there, is that though ISKP's footprint in Afghanistan has shrunk, but one thing which hasn't happened, that its ability to mount and plot overseas attacks has not weakened. And that is due to organizational duality of its structure. They have that inner core and they have the outer core. So what the Taliban primarily have weakened is the outer core, but the inner core stays intact. So if you look at different groups which plotted and executed overseas attacks, such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, the Islamic State, these groups had a safe sanctuary or control of territory where they trained, plotted, planned, and executed attacks. ISKP is the only exception to that norm, that they don't have a safe territory, yet their ability to plot and execute overseas attacks is increasing. Only yesterday or today, two ISKP sympathizers or supporters were arrested in Germany for trying to plot an attack against the Swedish parliament over the Quran burning. A couple of months ago, just last month, if I'm correct, in February, January, February, there was one plot in Russia, which was, thwarted. There was one more so there was one in Russia, there was one in Turkey. Sure. So ISKP's ability to plot overseas attacks is increasing. And I think that's dangerous and a space to watch, in a sense that while everyone believes that the epicenter of global jihadism has moved to the Sahel region in Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan has a more localized problems, and a lot of it is the creation of the Pakistani state, which is true. One has to watch out for ISKP. To date, 21 terrorist plots have been traced. Plots and attacks overseas have been traced to ISKP. So as global jihadism really weakened, in a sense where I contradict myself that localization is the order of the day as far as the jihadist world is concerned, but ISKP is a norm, is an exception to that norm. So I think we are in a new phase of militancy. We are looking at Gen Z of jihadists here. We have four broad trends. Centralization has replaced decentralization. Violence has been met with robust political propaganda. Localization has replaced regionalization, and cooperation is replacing rivalries in this part of the world as far as jihadism is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Antonio, do you want to respond to at least some of the many things that were said, and then we can move ahead?
Yeah, I will respond briefly because, it's good to leave some time to question and answers if there are any. So I want to clarify that, of course, dealing with all this number of jihadist groups in Pakistan in a book meant that, of course, I could not basically detail the history of every single one of them. So for example, if you take TTP, I'm not discussing in detail the origins of TTP or the details of the history. I focus on the relationship really with two things, global jihad on the one hand and the Pakistani state on the other. So basically, you have to make a choice, of course. And the book is already quite thick and fine print. So I think there was already the limit of what could be manageable in a single volume. So that means that you have to make some compromises, basically. And I think, as Abubakar noticed, it's already a book that is not particularly, friendly to the average reader because it's a bit already heavy. So certainly going beyond that will not be feasible. And so I think it's a good point that Farzana made about the origins of this relation with the jihadists, basically already in 1947. I had to take a point of departure, or also for practical reasons. So me, Afghanistan is a turning point. Why? Not because it's completely new in terms of the relationship, but because, of course, was an operation aimed abroad and was done in cooperation with other actors, in particularly Gulf countries and United States. So that kind of legitimized the use of these tools, at least in the mind of the Pakistani army. They thought that after all, even the Americans approved of it, they were doing themselves. So that could be a tool that was used, could be expanded well beyond an internal use, so to speak. So I think that for me is a turning point because led to essentially the decision of using it on a much larger scale in general, beyond Afghanistan, like India, Kashmir. But of course, every turning point is a bit an arbitrary choice, but it was also quite convenient for me, for my narrative, to have a point of departure for the book that was not too remote in time. And then some of the things that Abdul Basit said, I fully agree. And I think it's very interesting to think about the organization TTP, which becomes quite an important point in, how you address or how Pakistan addresses this threat is, I would say, is not actually not centralized, not decentralized, in a sense like the Taliban. They managed to find the right middle, in a structure that is not too centralized to alienate what essentially are largely tribal members, which who are very alien to strong centralization, strong discipline, but at the same time not too loose to make it unviable to have a strategy. So they found a way to kind of develop a structure that allows for strategizing without being resented by the members as too oppressive in a way. And that, of course, is something new, if you like. It's not like a Leninist organization for sure, but it's not like a tribal revolt, completely disorganized either, So as ATTP eventually ended up being before Nur Wali kind of reformed it. So I think this kind of right middle, right for them, of course, is a real innovation. And then the only other point I wanted to make in the interest of time is the role of which I didn't address in my short presentation at the beginning, the role of the Taliban. And of course, there is this kind of imitation effect, the very fact. It's a bit like, the October Revolution, of course, achieving something, succeeding, demonstrate that a certain political ideology is viable. At least they're in power, this is something. As it happens, usually any kind of revolutionary movements, even those who don't call themselves revolutionary, like the Taliban, they actually don't know what they will do once they're in power. No, they might have some ideas, but usually these ideas don't work. Also because the condition that you have after you take power, after a long civil war with everything devastated, the economy doesn't work, basically all these kind of utopias, usually, if they ever work, they won't work in a country after a civil war. So then you have to basically make it up as you move forward. And I think this book that Abdul mentioned, from the Ministry of Justice of the Taliban is interesting because it's an first attempt so far, quite authoritative because it's a minister and is a very close listen to advisor of the Amir, is an attempt to kind of develop an idea of a system, of an Islamic system in a Sunni context. I think clearly they couldn't quote Khomeini and they couldn't quote a Shia text, they're to kind of build something using whatever resources they had. So yeah, there is some Deobandi text, but also Qaidist authors, Muslim Brother authors, mixed up, pragmatically picking from different sources to come up with an argument in favor of an Islamic State where essentially the mullahs are ruling, and that's a difficult thing to argue in a Sunni context. Overall, of course, the political and ideological debate is very poor, but that's part of a more general trend. If I look around here in Europe, we have politicians now that don't read books, they tweet, right? So, and they only read tweets as well. So probably, at this point, we shouldn't expect the Taliban or jihadists to be even better than our politicians out here in Europe or North America. So that's probably a general trend. And this idea, Nurwali is the TTP leader is believed to be quite an intellectual type. He does write books, although they're not necessarily big intellectual achievements, but he does write. So it's quite an intellectual figure within that realm. But in general, I think the trend is being definitely towards kind of an impoverishment of the debate. And I don't think there is a sense that you really need to be very sophisticated intellectually to succeed first, and then to establish a system. In Afghanistan, now we see the Taliban are divided or polarized between pragmatists who think, but let's do like the monarchy, it's conservative enough. Instead of a king, we have an Amir, that's enough, so very pragmatic. And at the end, people like the Minister of Justice and the Amir who want something more substantial, or something that shows that it's really an Islamic system, not just kind of slightly Islamized monarchy. And I think these kind of debates are not only in Afghanistan, we see them essentially also like in Syria, where Ayatollah Sham, you have this kind of dynamics between those who say basically, let's recycle ourselves into the mainstream, let's be pragmatic, and the more ideological elements who want something different. And I think it's another contradiction or another issue internal to the jihadist movement, on top of what Farzana was mentioning, and also basically have this multiplication of debates. It could be, it could still be in a sense a crisis of growth, because in politics, I think what really matters is not being smart, but achieving something. So taking power would be seen by many as a demonstration that, even if what they say intellectually might look rubbish, there's some value in it simply because they succeed, So it might still be that they manage to basically scrap through, even if the debate is really surprisingly weak and poor. And of course, I don't see the TTP winning in a war in Pakistan, but it's not impossible, perhaps in the medium long term, for them to strike some kind of deal on a more pragmatic basis. And I will stop here.
Sure. Thank you, Antonio. I'm going to give you a breather, but we'll come back to some of the other issues that have been raised. There is one question we have from a member of the audience, but it is for you, Farzana. So, it's about when you said about how politicians have normalized the language of jihad in Pakistan. Yeah? And the question is, could you say a bit more about how the three parties have done so, i.e. normalize the language of jihad, the three political parties?
Well, I did try in my presentation to sort of pick on a few instances. I mean, in the 1990s, for example, I cite the example of the Pakistan People's Party, otherwise, known as Pakistan's most secular party, forging a working relationship with the Jamiatul Ulema Islam, the premier sort of Islamic party with strong roots in the Deobandi traditions. Now, as Antonio will tell you, I mean, groups, Sunni sectarian groups like the SSP, like the LEJ, the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, are all, all developed from the JUI. And these were the groups that the JUI had a close working relationship with. And Maulana Fazlur Rahman, who leads the JUI in the 1990s, as I said, forged a very close relationship with the Pakistan People's Party. Now, as I indicated in my presentation, the Pakistan People's Party is not the only party to have developed a relationship with groups such as the JUI. But of course, we also had the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, currently, by all accounts, Pakistan's ruling party. Its leader, Shahbaz Sharif, is the Prime Minister. Work by Nilofer Siddiqui, which looks at violence and political parties, has a terrific chapter on the way in which the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz went to great lengths to expand its constituency in Punjab by forging a working relationship with the SSP. Key figures in the PMLN, such as Rana Sanaullah, for example, have actually publicly shown their cooperation with groups like the SSP and the LEJ by campaigning openly with these groups during the last election. So, none of this is really a secret. And then, of course, finally, there is Imran Khan, and as I said, I mean, he has probably been most upfront about, wanting to push what many regard as a populist agenda with a clear Islamist inflection to it. So I think, what I was trying to suggest is that while, yes, the military establishment is the one we all tend to focus on in terms of the way in which, jihadist groups have been co-opted, the language of jihadism appropriated, political parties, mainstream political parties in Pakistan have also normalized the language of jihad through their relationship with violent jihadi groups.
Right, thank you. Antonio, I was actually going to bring you back to something that Abubakar said, which interested me very much. And that, in fact, that was one of the reasons I wanted Abubakar to clarify what he had said, just in case anyone listening to the event had not understood clearly what was being said. And that, to put my question simply, and this is knowing very well, not only having read your book, but also knowing very well that your book is about Pakistan, and the book is in that sense from that perspective. Do you think there's been a change since you did research for the book and the book was published? It's been a while, in the dynamics of between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the whole question of jihad is concerned?
Well, basically, when I handed over the manuscript, it was just, I think, after the regime change. So it was difficult at the time, to see where things would be going. And I think the Afghan Taliban themselves are divided about what to do with TTP and what to do with Pakistan. And actually, the main issue that divided full stop. The Taliban compete internally for power, essentially, and they essentially position against each other because of this power struggle. So originally, in the early days post-regime change, it was Eastern Taliban and Southeastern Taliban, the Afghani group and Taliban in the East, who were very supportive of TTP. And were at the same time the relation with the Pakistani authorities. And there was this expectation from Pakistan they would kind of fix the problem because of being there in the middle. And there were attempts, of course, there were attempts to kind of find a solution. But the problem is that TTP is hugely popular in Afghanistan, in the East, at the popular level and among the Taliban. But the Taliban see the TTP people who have been fighting alongside them for many years as comrades in arms. But also the local population is not so much like TTP, they hate Pakistan. That's the bottom line. It's a very specific situation in the East, especially along the border. So essentially the Taliban were a bit shaky. They have limited resources, but also, as I said, compete with each other. They don't want, or especially the Eastern Taliban, they don't want to dump the TTP for the sake of Pakistan. They never wanted to do it. They try to mediate, but of course, the room maneuver there is very limited, right? TTP feels that now they got kind of upper hand. They're not in a position anymore to risk being eradicated, one. And two, the Pakistani state finds difficult to compromise with them, right? So I think there's very little room of maneuver there, on the one hand. On the other hand, among the Afghan Taliban, there are those who think, well, at the end of the day, in the long run, the reason why the Eastern Taliban have grown over time is because they were receiving Pakistani support, much more than the Southern Taliban. But in the Taliban, usually Pakistan privileged the Eastern Taliban over the Southern Taliban. Now, the Southern Taliban see an opportunity to undermine their rivals on the East by reaching out to Pakistan and essentially appeasing Pakistan and making sure Pakistan will not support in these internal power struggles the Easterners, because that brings quite considerable advantage to the Southern Taliban. That's the reason why essentially Islamabad has been looking recently more at the Amir and the people around the Amir in Kandahar, as opposed to the traditional allies in the East. They've been trying to reach out to the Afghanis, but the Afghanis are gradually distanced themselves. They're very much more worried about maintaining the internal constituency. And the one thing on which they all agree, all the Taliban agree, that they don't want to risk TTP joining or allying with Islamic State, because the TTP has a significant military strength in the east of Afghanistan, thousands of men in remote valleys, which could really create a serious security problem for the Taliban. The Taliban, people don't understand that the Taliban are very stripped of resources. They can't deploy their army. They make these big claims about there being a huge army, but in reality, there are only 6,000 or 7,000 men deployed to the ground. They can't pay for the fuel. An army costs money to deploy. So the army is not deployed. The entire counterinsurgency is a few thousand of intelligence special forces and the police, which are, of course, deployed wherever there is some population. So it would be a serious issue if they had to fight the TTP. And my understanding is that in Pakistan, diplomats are more understanding of the Taliban point of view. The military has taken a very, strong, opinionated view that, they can't tolerate this and they're being quite strong up. I think they don't understand that in Afghanistan, carrying out raids or using a strong language is counterproductive and is forcing even those Taliban leaders who would be in favor of some kind of appeasement with Pakistan to turn away from that, because it can be seen as being soft on Pakistan after this kind of actions.
Okay, Abubakar, did you want to come in response to what Antonio just said?
Yeah, I think Antonio.
Briefly, please.
You can hear me, of course. Yeah. Okay. So very quickly, I think the TTP, the Taliban, I think Basit mentioned that they don't have a very well structured whatever thought, but I think that's not true. In fact, Taliban is one of the most organized most disciplined military organization in Afghanistan in the past 40 years. All the other Afghan jihadist organizations have fought among themselves. In the Taliban, there were few minor rebellions, but overall the Taliban have stayed united, and following their leader is a religious obligation. So the Taliban have very specific view about the state that they want to have. It is what I will call an Islamist Afghanistan, more Islamist than perhaps any of the other Islamists want it to be. For example, the banning of the girls' education, which is completely wrong, and that sort of things. But I think the Taliban also have revived some kind of an Islamist Afghan nationalism. I increasingly see the Taliban referring to Durand Line as the fake border line, as they call it, quote unquote. They see the TTP. Of course, the TTP has all these relations, personal relations and command relations, but I think the Taliban also see particularly the former FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, as part of this Afghanistan that they are ruling now. So one of the key demands of the negotiations which were brokered by the Haqqanis initially after the Taliban take over was that the Taliban Pakistan backroll all the reforms it made in governing former tribal areas. It's now part of regular Pakistani laws. Its FATA has been dismantled. It's merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in the northwest. And that is something that Taliban want to roll back. Of course, we should also remember that Pakistan has miserably failed in its Afghan policy. Pakistan has not created, it has tried to, what it viewed as its key threat, the dismantling of secular Afghan nationalism. But in the process, Pakistan has not created any friends. And the treatment of Afghans in Pakistan since 2014 or after 2010 has, and particularly after since the past year, has been so horrible that it has, I think, given the Taliban a chance to cash on anti-Pakistan feelings.
Thanks. I was just going to add one more thing, which is that Abdul said, Antonio, this is to you. Abdul said that there was a new phase of militancy, and it sort of ties up with what we've just been discussing. And you did respond to it briefly, but did you want to say anything more? Or Abdul, did you want to briefly, quickly say anything more? We have one more issue to cover, and we have about 10-ish minutes.
Okay, quickly I just want to clarify that my remark about the Taliban is not about that they're not a disciplined group. They are, Abubakar is quite right. They are the most disciplined group in Afghanistan, which has held together in the last 20 years, or if you see from the rise of the movement in the last 30, 35 years, that's correct. My point was about the intellectual sophistication of the group. There is no one document that one could refer to. Now there is one that their Chief Justice has come up with. Other than that document, it was very hard to learn about their world. Yes, their worldview is known through stories. Their worldview is known through anecdotes, various books that former or existing Taliban leaders such as Mullah Salam Zaif has written, etc. But an official document was missing, which now they have added. And even with that document, there is a lot being borrowed. So they are a Deobandi militant organization, but what kind of Deobandism they follow, right? That is where I'm coming from. So consistent with what Dr. Farzana said, that the intellectual bankruptcy in these organizations runs consistently, whether it is the Taliban, the Islamic State, or any other organization for that matter. About the new phase of militancy, which I referred to, I think we need to look at the way these groups are regrouping, the way they are changing their strategic objectives, the way they are honing their narratives, and the way they are using Taliban's umbrella, protection umbrella, to their advantage. and using emerging technologies such as social media to attract new recruits in the educated middle classes beyond the tribal areas or the newly merged districts or ex-FATA region. Yeah, I just wanted to say that and move on to that.
Sure. Antonio, I'll of course give you a chance to respond, but I did want you to cover one more point, and I wanted to give you the chance to talk about it, which was a point that Farzana raised, which was about women and their role in the jihadist movement. And I know, of course, that your book is very largely based on interviews. It is difficult to interview women, et cetera, all those sorts of things. But it has happened, as Farzana laid out, over a period of time. It also does, in a very interesting sort of way, in a very intellectual sort of way, if I can put it that way, ties up with the other point that was being discussed a short while ago, which was about academic intellectual calibers of the thinking people within these movements, because if you look at the whole debate over women's education in Afghanistan since August of 2021, it's very interesting how one group of the Taliban is more amenable to it than another group of the Taliban, and at the end of it, the end result remains the same. So, did you want to say a bit about it, just what your thoughts are, especially, as I said, in response to Farzana's point, and then Abubakar wants to make one more. Abdul wants to make another point.
Right. Yes. So, I think, in a sense, I explain the fact that Taliban have been able to stay united, and now that the TP is able to reunite with the adoption of a model of organization that is not too disciplined. I mean, you split when there is a reason for splitting. If you have an organization that allows for some room of maneuver within it, some differences in terms of the way you operate, the way you think, then there's no need to split, right? Why would you split? So you usually split in, for example, Leninist organizations split all the time, because if you disagree with the leadership, the only way you can continue to do your own things is splitting. So it's very centralized. You had a lot of splits in Afghanistan, the Muslim Brother organization, over time, because again, very centralized. You don't agree, okay, you have to go. With the Taliban, because there's this element of organized decentralization. Decentralization is very different from fragmentation. Decentralization implies there is a system where you manage differences, and dissent or different views are allowed within certain limits. For example, the Taliban allowed even fundraising done separately by different discrete parts of the organization. So that has to be managed, So you need a kind of system at the center that keeps track of this and also kind of manages it. And you need to kind of a venue. That's why the Taliban are not internally, they're not an autocratic organization. There's not, now things are maybe changing. The Emir is trying to impose himself, but over the years, especially after 2001, they've been having some kind of, if you like, even internal democracy, where different groups having discussion, votes in the leadership council, sometimes the leaders being in the minority. So they figure out how to manage it. And that's why they stay united, but we have to understand they're united, but there are differences. And these dynamics are constantly there. Like you would have in a party in Western Europe, you have competition, even they're united, you have competition for leadership within certain limits that's allowed. So now the debate is how much power the Emir should have. Yes, the Emir is the leader, but really the extent of the power, especially in terms of executive power, how much executive power it should have. Should it be just responsible for Islamic law, or should he, like Khamenei, interfere with the working of the government, especially on security matters? So I think that's the current debate. And the TTP has adopted a similar model, after in the past there were attempts to over-centralize it, that create a lot of rejection and resentment, and that cause splits. So they've kind of accepted that that's counterproductive. You cannot do it among Pashtuns, in rural Pashtun areas. It simply doesn't fly. I think in terms of new phase of militancy, I think, as I said, the TTP has reformed itself, and now is able to reunite groups which are mostly former TTP. You know, there are some new people joining, but mostly there are fragments of TTP rejoining. But then I think for me, the real new militancy is Islamic State, not only in Pakistan, but also in Afghanistan. Women come into the picture. So it's mostly the Islamic State that's able to mobilize women. To be honest, in Afghanistan, not a lot. We found some. But for example, there is the daughter of Tayyul Dash, the leader of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, who is now with the Islamic State, is a commander. It's the only female commander they have, but they don't advertise it. They almost keep it hidden because, you know, they believe that the local context is not conducive to, you know, showing off their female members. So they're very cautious about that. They criticize the Taliban for not allowing women to study because they do recruit university students, female. So they do recruit them, but of course, the idea, you know, that you will operate under certain constraint, but even train militarily the female members, not to fight in battle, but just in case, you know, there have been cases of them fighting during Taliban raids in hideouts, you know, taking weapons and fighting and dying as well. So there's a different attitude. And the new thing compared to the Taliban, which is not absolutely new, but is new for that context, is that the Islamic State is at ease with university students, the people educated in secular universities, not madrasas. And the Taliban are essentially a clerical movement. Very rarely they manage to attract university-educated people. If they did, it was more the Taliban or the Eastern Taliban, who are not real Taliban, but the original Taliban in the South, they're all mullahs, essentially. What's new about new relative to that context, the Islamic State difference between them and the Taliban is that they are actually quite good at recruiting university students, and their model of operation is designed on that. It's much more centralized than the Taliban. And that's an interesting comparison because so far they've been able to centralize and impose a very rigid structure without suffering splits. Of course, they know they don't, the history is relatively short, but they've been quite good at staying united despite all the challenges, all the defeats, all the losses they suffer. So that's, I think, for me, is a more of a, if you like, intellectual challenge to understand that. And on women, as I said, you know, for Pakistan, really was focused on the relationship between global jihad and local jihad. So I didn't try, it was not my aim to kind of look at the sociological composition of these groups. It was beyond the scope of my research.
Oh.
Now in Afghanistan, we look into that and the role of women in the Islamic State.
Sure. And of course, I'm sure Farzana will also agree that this in and of itself is actually a topic for a completely separate event, the way in which the dynamics of women come in. Abubakar, my apologies. I said Abdul earlier. Please accept my apologies. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, but please come in. You wanted to make a point.
No worries. Thank you. Well, I wanted to make one point about I think the waning popularity or declining popularity of Salafism in general and Takfiri Salafism in particular. This is Takfiri Salafism was, of course, the moving ideology of global jihad, Al-Qaeda, IS, everybody. But I think because of the changes in the Middle East, primarily the secularization, or what you call it, the reforms in Saudi Arabia, maybe the drying up of the money. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, this is something actually that Antonio has alluded to in the very last graph of his book. Taliban have been very successful in dealing with Takfiri Salafism, which is now mostly manifest in Islamic State. The Taliban has quite harshly launched a crackdown against the 500,000 or so Salafis in Afghanistan, most of them, of course, concentrated in eastern Afghanistan. But the Takfiris overall, Salafis are still overall a group that has kind of retained some power, and that's why I think IS's main whatever center, nerve center or ideological nerve center, because most of their ideological leaders or the ulama that they follow live in and around Peshawar, are not in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, perhaps this chapter of Takfiri Salafism might be over because the Taliban have to have respond to some for their own political interests, of course, but they have to respond some of these sentiments within the country, the demands, for example, what is happening to Afghans in Pakistan, how Pakistan is universally held responsible for everything that pretty much that has gone wrong in Afghanistan. And I think that's a major step in the future of Salafism. Of course, I mean, in the future of jihadism in this region, particularly Pakistan, because of course, some groups will adopt the successful tactics of Takfiri Salafis, but the ideology, they will not adopt the ideology, they will not against the thing. And the thing is that in Afghanistan, for example, the Taliban, I remember one Taliban minister, I think it's the Minister of Education, he was giving a speech a few days ago, and he called the Salafis dogs. Particularly, he was mentioning, of course, the Islamic State members. And this shows you that Afghanistan, perhaps under the Taliban, will not become a center of global Takfiri-driven jihadism in the near future.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I'm deeply conscious of time. So this has been extremely interesting for all of us, but also for everyone who's been watching. And I am going to sign off immediately. But I did want to say one thing, which is very important, and I say it at the end of almost every event that I do, is that I think if there's anything good that has come out of the pandemic, it has been that we've all become very technologically savvy. And as a result, we are all able to convene these meetings and these gatherings across time and space, and have these wonderful conversations which we can bring to the benefit of for the benefit of the audience members as well as for each other. That said, it does not take away from a very moot point, which is we wouldn't be able to do these events if all of you individually and collectively would not give so generously of your expertise, of your time, and of your knowledge. So a very, very sincere thank you to all of you, Farzana, Abubakar, Abdul, and of course to Antonio for writing the book and then agreeing to have a discussion around it. Thank you very